Chapter 25 of The Man with the Red Beard by David Whitelaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 25 Trapped. Left to ourselves, Monsieur Bellis and I proceeded with our meal, but looking back I seemed to see that there was a certain restraint in the manner of my companion. For some reason which I could not even guess at, he appeared to be somewhat nervous, and although he answered the questions I put to him, and which concerned mostly the man who had just left, he did so in a preoccupied manner, not raising his eyes from the tablecloth where he was rolling morsels of bread into little pellets, and twirling the stem of his claret glass between his thumb and finger. I could almost imagine that Felix Marazeff was possessed of some hypnotic power, and that in leaving the rat he had left his influence behind him. This idea was given additional support by the fact that as the meal came to a close, my friend had regained, in his part, his usual spirits. But it was more than likely that it was the amount of wine he had consumed, for friend Bellis was no laggard where the bottle was concerned. Although on this occasion my companion was acting as host, I did not imagine that he would raise any great objections to my suggestion that we should go elsewhere for coffee and liqueurs. I have, I think, before mentioned that the rat gave little evidence of worldly wealth. I made my suggestion with a purpose. I felt that while we were in the restaurant the evil influence of Marazeff pervaded the place. Perhaps in other surroundings Bellis would prove more talkative, and I might be able to get at the bottom of his altered manner. It was unbearably hot also in the little Soho restaurant, and however well one has enjoyed a meal, it is not pleasant to smell the cooking of similar meals over one's cigar. Bellis called the waiter and paid the bill, a painful process which meant, apparently, diving into every pocket in his clothes in an effort to round up loose cash. At last, after each item on the bill had received his closest scrutiny, the addition was paid and we left the place. The streets of Soho were very quiet. No doubt many of the inhabitants were enjoying a siesta. My walk of the morning, together with the lunch, had bred in me a certain drowsiness, and I would gladly have followed their example. But it is a curious thing with our big cities, that the drowsiness of its teeming people is uncatered for. There are places where one may eat, drink, read, play billiards, in fact, do almost anything but sleep. We walked slowly through the street beside the Shaftesbury Theatre, and entered a restaurant in Leicester Square. It was deliciously cool here after the stuffiness of the restaurant and the glare of the pavements, and the rat and I lingered over our liqueurs into the middle of the afternoon. For me it was just one way of spending the time until I would again go up to the Heath and to Myra. We spoke of many things, and gradually I brought the conversation round to the subject of Paul Bergstoff. I wanted to ask Bellis more concerning the press-cutting he had shown me in Moscow, and which asserted that the man who had been shot in Leicester Square had died in prison from the effects of the bullet. In my gathering together of evidence against Felix Marazeff, I imagined that this cutting might be useful. Could it be proved, as I suspected, that it had been inserted at the spy's instigation by some newspaper subsidized by the government, in order to prove to the revolutionaries that their death sentence had been duly carried out by the man commissioned to do the act? There was but little doubt in my mind that the wretch had taken on the killing of Bergstoff for more than one reason. Not only would he be removing a possible rival to his affair of the heart, but he would solidify his position in the revolutionary ranks by this show of zeal, and, incidentally, gain further the trust of their leaders, so that he might have more to sell to his master the Tsar. "The cutting. Ah, yes," Bellis was saying. "I can show it to you. I do not leave things like that behind me. It is in my rooms." "What? Here in London?" I asked, for I felt that another careful reading would be sufficient for me to remember it word for word, and moreover I was anxious to trace, if possible, the paper it had been cut from. In Moscow I had given it but the most casual reading, not wishing to appear anxious, or to have any real interest in it. "It is not 10 minutes from here, Monsieur Draffo. I will show it to you with pleasure." I had never been to the rat's rooms, and I rather welcomed the opportunity. He lived, I understood, alone, and an hour spent with his book of cuttings might prove of the greatest value to me. And so when, a little later, we had finished our coffee, we made our way back to Soho and up to the room where Monsieur Bellis had his habitation during his visits to London. Whatever Dr. Muirden and Felix Marazeff made out of the depredations practised by the little gang of desperadoes at Norwood, it would not appear, judging from the approach to the rat's abode, that that gentleman was overpaid for any services he might give to the cause. We turned into a street. I think it led into Dean Street, narrow and dingy, and about half-way down we entered an ill-paved court, containing perhaps a dozen houses, and ending with a high brick wall which looked as though it might be the side of some large warehouse. It was windowless, and covered to the height of some 20 feet with ragged posters. The houses were for the most part empty, and those which had tenants appeared scarcely less desolate than those without. Mean little hovels, the windows broken and grimed, the curtains, where there were any, dirty and ragged. They looked what they were, the habitations of those who had sunk to the lowest ebb of degradation. If it had been hot and oppressive in the streets, it was doubly so in this airless court, with its offensive odours arising from the garbage barrels before some of the doors. There were 2 or 3 women standing on the steps of one of the houses, low-browed, foreign creatures, their greasy blouses rolled up to the elbow, who nodded silently to Bellis as we passed. Round the lamp-post which stood erect in the centre of the court some children of the district had placed a rope and were playing some game. I took it to be a representation of an execution. Then I saw that my guide had stopped before the last door on the left-hand side, and was fumbling in his pockets for a key. I remember feeling a touch of what was perhaps fear as I took in my surroundings. As far as I could judge, I was in a little colony from which escape, did it become necessary, might prove difficult. It seemed hard to realize that the life of the West End of London was within a few feet of me. I might have been in the depths of a Polish ghetto. Never until that moment had I had the least suspicion of the rat's feelings toward me. Even then, as I looked at the man, I laughed at myself for letting my nerves get the better of me, but I made up my mind that I would not grace the residence of Monsieur Bellis for more than a few minutes. Then he had the door open, holding it so that I should enter. He followed me inside and closed it with a little bang. He muttered an apology as he passed in front of me and led the way along a narrow passage. It was almost in darkness, but the little light which did percolate through the dirt-encrusted panes of the fanlight showed me walls from which the cheap marble paper had peeled, leaving great damp patches. There was no furniture in this hall, save on the right, where a row of pegs held an overcoat or 2. The floor, I could feel, was covered with some kind of linoleum. The pervading smells of the place was paraffin and oily cooking. The crazy, uncarpeted stairs creaked beneath our weight as we made our way to a room in the front of the floor above, from which what I remembered of the outside appearance of the house would be the top. The apartment, at first sight, seemed to be dining, sleeping, and work-room combined. In one corner an iron bedstead stood, with the blankets disordered, as though the occupier had just risen. Along one wall, and so placed that what light could find its way through the grime of the windows fell upon it, was a heavily built bench. At one end some one had evidently been making a meal, for a copy of Le Matin had been spread out for a cloth, and on it a broken long French loaf lay, together with a portion of highly coloured sausage, still in the paper of the delicatessen shop where it had been purchased, and a small bottle of claret. One of the windows had been slightly opened, but it was not enough to have any beneficent effect on the atmosphere. Perched up there under the slates, the room was unbearable, filled with 101 odours of uncleanliness. At the other end of the bench a man was working. He had his back bent towards us, but as we entered he turned and raised his head. I felt no surprise in recognition of him as one of the men I had seen in the Norwood villa on the night of my visit. Doubtless here was one of the 2 men who had been in the garden of Sir Boris Fenberg's house in Park Lane. He was a narrow-faced, rabbity man, with cavernous eyes and a little fringe of yellow beard. He gave me a quick nod of recognition, and, had I thought for a moment, I might have wondered that there should have been no surprise in the look he gave me. This man, who presumably was hiding from the police almost within a stone's throw of the scene of his crime, might naturally be expected to show some surprise at 2 men entering the room when he had only been expecting one. It seemed almost as if he had had some knowledge of my coming. He turned again immediately and resumed his work. On the bench before him I saw a few cylindrical pieces of metal, and among the litter of tools a phial or 2 containing liquids showed. The tools, which the man took no care to hide, were palpably burglarious, and I told myself that the estimate I had made of the purposes to which the gang devoted its energies had not been far wrong. Monsieur Bellis closed the door when we had entered, and, motioning me to a seat, crossed over to the window and made a remark that I could not catch to the man at work there. Then the rat took up a claret bottle and held it up to the light, putting it down with a grunt of disapproval when he saw it was all but empty. There had been a few words between us as we had entered the house, but I cannot now remember what they were. We had spoken of generalities only. Now, however, I asked my host to show me the book. My words seemed to call him back from a land of daydreams. Ah, yes, the book. Bellis turned from the window and seemed to stand in indecision. I was growing impatient to get the business over and leave this horrible room. "Yes, Bellis," I said, "I remember I have an appointment at my hotel. It had slipped my memory, I am afraid, and I will not be able to wait long." Surely the manner of the man was rather strange. I said that he had been drinking heavily at and since lunch, but did that account for his curious actions and the strange looks, in which I imagined I read pity, he gave me? The feeling of uneasiness that I had experienced as I found myself in the court came over me again, and I think had the door been open I should have made an effort to get away. Then I told myself again that it was nerves. Bellis had fallen on his knees beside the bed and was drawing from beneath it an old leather portmanteau, much worn and belabelled. He was speaking to me about Bergstoff as he unstrapped it, but he mumbled his words, and my own thoughts were too busy for me to take much heed of what he said. Then he came towards me with the book I remembered having seen in Moscow. I noticed that his hands trembled. As he walked across the room he opened it at the page I required, and, pushing aside the debris of the luncheon, placed it on the bench, where it was fairly light, pointing to the cutting I had asked for with the black fringed nail of his index finger. I read the extract carefully, and now that I knew Bergstoff was alive, I could easily trace the mind of the traitor who had inspired this printed proof of the success of a mission which he had bungled for those who had commissioned it. Beside me the man with the fair beard worked on, tapping with a little hammer on metal, and I called to mind a similar tapping which I had heard in the house at Norwood. I could not see what the man was doing as his arm shielded his work. As I glanced in his direction, however, I saw that he was looking sideways, regarding me. Again my fears came thickly upon me in spite of myself. Perhaps the man read my thoughts, for he turned his head back into the room as though looking for Bellis. The man had left me while I had been reading. I wondered why he was so quiet. Then the thing happened. I felt strong arms round me, enveloping my head in the folds of some material which smothered me from light and air. I leapt to my feet and hit out wildly, then fell fighting across the bench. I heard the claret bottle fall, and, it is curious how small things impress themselves on the mind, listened to it as it rolled along to the wainscoting. Still I fought. I felt my knuckles glance on the side of the head of one of my attackers, but, stifled as I was, and in darkness, the odds were too heavy for me. I knew at last that I was lying bent back on the bench, and that I was powerless. Evidently the ruffians had succeeded in binding my arms, although I have no remembrance of them doing it. I felt a hand at my hip pocket, and my revolver was withdrawn, and with it my last hope seemed to go. I was lifted up and carried across the room and tumbled on to what I took to be the bed I had seen on my entrance. The sickly odour of chloroform pricked my nostrils, and the material which swathed my head grew cold and moist at my mouth. Doubtless only a moment passed, but to me it was an eternity of fierce dreams. Then I seemed swirling through clouds at night, stars in the blackness. End of chapter 25.